So the first topic I'd like us to start with is one that you discuss quite often, and it's anatheism. And I'd like you to explain what it is and how is it relevant to our world today.
Um, yeah, I think it's very relevant to our world today because, in a way, it's not a prescription. It's, as I see it, a description of actually what many, if not most people, certainly in the West, are experiencing in terms of a taking very seriously the death of God. Um, Philosophically, I know that only applies to a certain amount of people who read philosophy, but Nietzsche's declaration of the death of God, of power and might, um, who basically governs the universe in terms of absolute moral values, which, as Nietzsche argued, are not coming from God, but they're coming from us. It's an anthropomorphic morality. It's therefore necessary to conduct a genealogy of morals, to go back and see where did these moral ideas come from, the notion of the good and the notion of God. And in fact, both were very related in terms of Gottlich in Indo-European languages. So that was one, as philosophy has shown. And then there's Freud, who argued that God is, in many respects, a projection, an illusory projection, to console us. It's an infantile fantasy. And as such, we have a dependency upon it to provide solutions for all our neuroses. But it itself is an obsession neurosis, as he argued. So the discovery of the unconscious, the discovery with Nietzsche of power, the dynamics of power in our beliefs, in our practices. We think that we are behaving well, but in fact, underneath that very often, there is a power play. And then, of course, Marx and the Frankfurt School critical theory with the critique of ideology, that God is the opium of the people. So all of these have to be taken seriously and are taken seriously by philosophy, contemporary philosophy. I'm speaking as a philosopher here. But these critiques of the God of power and might, the God of delusion and illusion, of domination, of dissimulation, they don't come from nowhere. They actually correspond to something that's going on in the world. And in a modern turn, from a dependency on an external force beyond the human to a radical humanism. This would correspond, say, again, philosophically, to Kant's Copernican revolution, where he radicalizes Descartes' notion that the human cogito, the human I think, human consciousness, is the master and possessor of nature. So just as Copernicus discovered that that the universe was not geocentric but heliocentric, so Kant discovers with Descartes and modern philosophy, the Copernican revolution as it's called in thought, that it is the human consciousness that is the center of things, not some external divine consciousness. So whether it's Galileo and Kepler and Newton in terms of modern science, whether it's the Enlightenment investigations of reason, whether it's Darwin's discovery of evolution in biology, all of these correspond to a basic movement of modernity away from a God-centered universe towards a more human-centered universe, more secular universe. And basically, that's a move from theism to atheism. And atheism expressed in different ways at different levels. But what I'm arguing with anatheism is that there's still something left over. There's a remainder when people have, as it were, exhausted their human critiques of the divine. There seems to be a conviction in many people, a feeling, a sentiment, a conviction a persuasion that there's something more, there's something else, that everything cannot be merely reduced to the human, to anthropocentrism, anthropomorphism, or humanism. It has brought huge advantages in terms of human rights, human liberties, a recognition of the incredible creativity of the human mind, of human reason, human imagination, all extraordinarily good things. Modern romanticism, modern idealism, modern rationalism, modern science, the Enlightenment. But it has been paid for at a certain cost. And that cost has been a certain disenchantment of the world, of nature, of the universe, of our relationship with other human beings. And anatheism is a way of saying there is something after the death of God. There is a God after God, some sentiment of the sacred that doesn't go away, that's very dear to people. You know, when even in our language we say, I hold this sacred, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to a church and lighting candles and partaking of the Eucharist, or confessing a confiture of a certain set of beliefs. But it means that there is something extra, some dimension of transcendence in the immanent, not somewhere else, off in some Platonic other world, some metaphysical, disembodied, ideal universe, but something within the immanent that nonetheless is a surplus of meaning. It's an extra, it's a more, it's a transcendence. And that feeling is, I think, shared by many, many people today, who may not necessarily confess a single faith, but are very interested in learning more about other religions. For example, the interest in the West in Eastern religions, in indigenous religions that have been basically ignored, neglected, suppressed until the present day, until modern time, contemporary times, I would say.
So
That
does
itself is
anatheism, does it relate to all the religions or only Western Christian beliefs?
I would say it relates to all of the religions. I've been telling a story up till now of the Western. It is true. But I think it's true of all religions to this extent that I think it's actually fundamental to human experience. You know, say, take Buddhism. In fact, I think anatheism in many respects comes from, for many people, an opening of Western consciousness to non-Western consciousness and traditions, and discovering that there are other ways of relating to the divine, which are not those of monotheistic theism and absolutism and Platonism, an absolute God in another world, but a way of relating to the world, to the universe, to other human beings in a way that is what the Buddhists called interbeing, that we're all in some sense connected to what they call Buddhahood, that it's within each person, and that we have to, in order to discover this sacred dimension of being, this deep spiritual dimension of being, which I would call anatheist, we have to go through a disillusionment. And that, for the Buddhists, and we can go to other religions, Taoism, Hinduism, and so on, if there's time, but just to stick with Buddhism for the moment, is captured in the phrase, first there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. That's anatheism for Buddhism. One starts with a basic set of beliefs, convictions, persuasions, and then one discovers that one is suffering, right? And that this suffering comes from the fact that we're attached to things and that this is illusory. So in order to become enlightened, spiritually free, and more compassionate towards other human beings and ourselves, we have to let go of that first mountain. First, there is a mountain. All those attachments and allurements and illusions, and go into a period of not knowing, of not having. There is no mountain. And then the third phase, the anatheistic phase, having gone through theism, atheism, is anatheism, which is then there is. There is something after the disappearance of the mountain, which is the mountain after the mountain. To put it in Christian terms, I know we're going into the interspiritual now, but I mean, anatheism is not something I invented or anybody else invented, Charles Taylor or Paul Ricoeur or any philosopher or any writer. And I think there are many people who share an anatheistic view in contemporary thought. It goes back in Christianity, for example, which is my own faith tradition, to Christ's own existential experience on the cross. When he says, please, he invokes a sort of an eternal Father God of almighty power and so on and might. And he says, please deliver me from this sacrifice. Then he finds himself on the cross and he says, why have you forsaken me? That's the moment of atheism. So he begins as a theist, father this, father that. He then experiences on the cross atheism. My God, why have you forsaken me? You didn't come and save me, rescue me, take away this chalice. And then finally he says, unto thee I commend my spirit. And that's the anatheist moment of letting go and letting be again. And it's important to let God be again after the death of God. Now, okay, I've returned to my own Christian story, but funnily enough, I and many others like me of my generation discovered the anatheist dimension of our own religion beyond dogmatism, beyond absolutism, beyond certitude, when in fact we engaged in dialogue and conversation with non-Christian religions. And they can be within the monotheist tradition, Islam and Judaism, or non-Abrahamic, non-Western. And so I think anatheism is profoundly interspiritual, because if you say that the God that I knew and thought I knew and believed in an absolute way is not the only God, or not the only way of believing in God, then one discovers not only that there is a plurality of beliefs out there are many ways of naming God, of thinking God, but also one rediscovers the plurality within one's own tradition. And that's been, I think, very, very liberating for many people. So the alternative is not theism versus atheism or absolutism versus humanism. That's, in a way, I'm suggesting a false polarity. And there is a third, and that is anatheism. And that's not just a matter of philosophical or theological beliefs, but is fundamental to each person's existential experience. Anybody who goes to bed at night thinking they know what the world is, what they are, what other people are, wakes in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, and says, I don't know anything, right? An existential crisis, I don't know anything. And then in the morning, you go back to sleep, you wake in the morning, and it's another day. That in itself is an anatheistic experience. First there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. I think
So
I know.
is anatheism a sort of natural development of human experience, or should we try to achieve it through some specific actions?
I think it's both. It's something that is going on all around us. It's something that happens in life, but it's also something that we can make a wager on, that we can take responsibility for, that we can decide upon one way or the other. I mean, Christ on the cross, who says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then unto thee I commend my spirit, and then turns and forgives his fellow crucified victims, is not just experiencing what is, but is actually responding to that, making an intervention, and then returning as a God after God. Christ comes back as a God after God. Nobody recognizes him when he first appears. The disciples don't recognize him. Mary Magdalene doesn't recognize him. The disciples on the road to Emmaus don't recognize him, because he's a God after God. It's Christ after Christ who returns again and again as a stranger. And so people don't recognize him until there's a breaking of the bread, or a sharing of food, a sharing of love, a healing. Like on the road to Emmaus, they don't recognize him until they sit down and share the bread. And that's an action. It's in the action of cooking fish and sharing it with his disciples, breaking bread, sharing it with his disciples, speaking and responding to Mary Magdalene and freeing her, touching Thomas's wound. These are actions, and they are anatheist actions. So it's not just a way of acknowledging the world as it is. First there's the mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. There's actually a choice to be made between the no mountain and the mountain that comes again. And we are, if you will, responsible for that. Just as at the very beginning of, I'm going back now to Western Abrahamic traditions, Abraham, when he's confronted with the stranger, has a choice between killing that stranger who comes with another way of believing, if you will. It's a radical outsider who comes from, and he welcomes him. Instead of killing him, he welcomes him. And Sarah and Abraham welcome the stranger who says, you shall have a child. So it's a new beginning. And Abraham and Sarah can't have children. If you like, they're in a barren, sterile relationship. And their theism is atrophying. It's a tribalism. It's an absolutism that excludes all others. Suddenly, by accepting the three strangers and giving them food, a new religion is born, called the Abrahamic religion, if you will, that then goes on to give birth to another religion, Christianity, another religion, Islam, then another religion and another, because Christ comes again and again and again. Presumably the Buddha, the Bodhisattva, comes again and again and again. And it's the again, the word ana means again, after, back, forth, in time and space, again.
So when you say it's sort of a wager, do you mean it in a sense like Pascal's wager, where it's more pragmatic? Or do you mean it that you need to wager on the stranger that you encounter? And you need to accept him as a friend?
It's both, but it's certainly more than the Pascalian wager, because the Pascalian wager is an epistemological one. It's one based on knowledge and, if you will, agnosticism. Anatheism is not just agnosticism. It's related to it in the phase of there is no mountain, there is no God, I do not know. I thought I knew everything, now I do not know anything. But in the case of Pascal, it's moving from certitude to doubt to faith. But it's about what can I know, right? And since I can't know, I'm still going to make a wager that this would be a better bet, right? So it's a calculation. It's a calculation. It's a rational calculation on faith. Whereas the anatheist wager is much more existential. Of course, it can involve the element of faith, doubt, and then a new faith. But it's much more experiential and existential. And in that sense is about becoming open to what is strange, other, different, diverse, and as represented by the stranger. And that's something we encounter, whether we're doing philosophy with Pascal in his Parisian salon, or whether one is doing philosophy with Descartes in his cabin as he's being chased by the Prussian army. It doesn't have to be that kind of cognitive thinking, intellectual gesture, but it can be that too. More fundamentally, it's an ontological wager. It's a wager of being that says, I am open to the call of the other. I'm open to the call of the other. Example I give in the book Anatheism is when Mary is confronted with a stranger who announces that she will give birth to another being. In all of the portraits of the Annunciation, the angel Gabriel appearing to Mary, there's two things usually shown. There's a book that Mary is reading, and there is a flower, usually a lily. And they represent the two kinds of wager in anatheism. Mary's being confronted with a radical stranger who's telling her that what was possible in the past is now impossible. Or rather, what was possible is now impossible. And what seems impossible, that she could have a child, that she could be the bearer of a God who is to come. She responds to that stranger and that very strange announcement that says, go beyond everything you've believed up until now. And she does so in two ways. One, she's reading the scriptures. So she's reading about Abraham welcoming the stranger, about Jacob welcoming Rachel at Jacob's well, whatever. She's rereading her tradition and trying to find guidance for it. But she's also reading maybe about the serpent who says to Adam and Eve, you shall be as gods. You know, that's somebody who comes out of nowhere and announces, you might say, a false God, a false way of being God. So she's weighing up these different options, intellectual, scriptural, literary. I mean, she probably was a very simple woman, but it is represented. She is represented in these famous paintings by Raphael, Botticelli, and so on, as reading a book on the one hand. So it is a Pascalian wager up to a point, one of thought, one of reading, one of wisdom, one of calculation. But on the other hand, it's existential and sensory. And that's very important. It's ontological. It's her being that's responding. She's responding through her senses. And that is the wisdom of savvy coming from savoir, to taste, or flair. She has flair, which comes from how we smell, how we scent. She has insight. Her eyes are seeing, but it's the eye of the heart that is seeing the stranger as the bringer of good news, of new life, and so on. And of course, there is the tactile always in the vegetal. And that's very important. It's not just the book, it's also the flower. It's also the senses. And sapientia, wisdom, comes from sapere, to taste. So at all levels, she's expressing both the ontological wager and the epistemological wager. And I think one can find similar examples of that anatheist move, and that double move of mind and body when it comes to the anatheist wager, not just in Christianity, and I mentioned Abraham and Sarah, but also in most of the great wisdom traditions.
And this other, you say, like the stranger, what or who is it in our today's life? Like,
It's everybody who knocks at the door. It's everybody. The stranger is everybody. St. Benedict's rule I was educated in a Benedictine monastery, and St. Benedict's rule, one of the most important teachings, is that whoever comes to the door, treat them as if they were Christ. Treat them as if they are God. Any stranger can be God. So it's the person at the border. It's the person at the end of the street who needs help, or in the street. It's the person who knocks at your door and asks for help. It's your brother and sister in need of help. It's yourself. It's the stranger in yourself that calls you and says, where are you? The stranger is potentially everywhere.
but how about those who are, like, to say it simply, who are bad people, who want to do terrible things? How do you differentiate?
Yeah.
How
Well,
do you treat them?
you treat them lovingly, even if that means killing them lovingly, to protect your own. But Dorothy Day, who I have great time for, she set up hospitality houses. I would call her a great anatheist in New York and downtown cities, city downtowns, during her lifetime in the, whatever, 30s, 40s, 50s. And she said that very often there'd be a knock at the door at 3:00 in the morning, and she'd open it. And she didn't know whether that person, that stranger knocking at the door, looking for food and warmth and shelter, was the Messiah or Jack the Ripper. There was no way of it. There was no way of knowing. And that's something we're faced with all the time. I mean, that's a dramatic way of putting it. but there's always a wager involved. And, a lot of people are a bit of both. And there's always the wager, as in Victor Hugo's Misérables, when Jean Valjean comes to the door of the Archbishop, the Monseigneur Muriel, and nobody else in the town will take him in because he's got the badge of the prisoner on his coat. But Muriel takes him in, and as it happens, he's warned against doing so. This is a dangerous man. He could be a killer. He could be a thief. Jean Valjean steals the Monseigneur's silver and absconds. But the point is, when he's brought back by the soldiers, by the police, and the bishop says, no, I gave him those silverware items, he's making a wager that act of forgiveness and love towards Jean Valjean will change Jean Valjean. In other words, that the Jack the Ripper in him will become the Messiah, that the bad in him will become the good. So there's always that wager. Probably the strangers who came to meet Abraham in the desert at Mamre, had swords in their sheaths, and they could have been killers if it came to a conflict, one tribe against another. But when they were welcomed by Abraham and Sarah unconditionally, the killer in them became the Messiah, and hostility became hospitality. Hence, the same root, as I've often argued in Guest Book and Anatheism and elsewhere, the same root applies for enemy and friend, hostis, which gives rise to hostility or hospitality. And it can turn on a dime. And that's the anatheist wager, is wagering that the stranger can be welcomed in such a way or addressed in such a way that hostility can become hospitality. But that's a very difficult process. It's a process of discernment and peacemaking. We know today, look at Ukraine, look at Gaza, it's the most difficult thing in the world to make peace amongst enemies. But you just keep going on. And the anatheist wager, as Mary Robinson, the UN Commission of Human Rights, put it, means that we are prisoners of hope. Hope isn't easy. Hope is hard. But we're prisoners of hope. We can't let go of it.
And what is an atheistic view of, for example, like real-world problems like immigration and immigration itself? Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's a problem that faces us every day here in the West, but not only in the West. I'm speaking from Ireland. It's a huge problem. There aren't enough houses. 100,000 Ukrainians were welcomed, and rightly so. And now there's a housing problem. There's a social security problem. This is faced by most countries in Western Europe at the moment. It's a huge problem, but that doesn't mean that you give up on trying to do your best in hoping that you can receive as many as possible. But you can't.
Don't you have
everybody.
Don't you have responsibility for your family or your country first?
Of course you do. Of course you do.
So,
yeah. And that's why Dorothy Day or anybody standing at that hospitality house where there's a knock at the door has to discern anatheistically whether the person at the door, if admitted, could be the murderer or the potential murderer of the woman who's been hosted and welcomed earlier that day because of domestic abuse. And this could be the perpetrator of that abuse who's coming to finish the job and kill her. And in that instance, the correct thing to do is to close the door. Kant had an argument that you can never lie. And, the counter-argument to that is, well, if your Jewish family in the war And are you protecting a Jewish family in the war? And the Nazis come to the door and knock and say, are you protecting Jews? You don't say, oh, well, Kant says I have to tell the truth. Yes, I'm protecting Jews. In you go, shoot them, take them to Auschwitz, whatever. No, you tell a lie, but you tell a lie hospitably, anatheistically, lovingly. And that's difficult. I mean, anatheism isn't easy. That's why it's a wager. It's not a certainty. It's not a given. It's not even probably a probability. It's about possibility. And so it's agonizingly difficult to remain an atheist in the face of these difficult daily decisions. But they are daily. It's not like, I was a theist yesterday. I had the answers for everything. I believed in this God or that God or the other God. Then I went through the night, dark night of the soul, couldn't sleep. I became an atheist. Then I woke up this morning and I'm an anatheist and everything is solved. No. Anatheism is constantly moving back and forth between theism and atheism and agnosticism and so on. It's not something you reach and then, you've found Mount Pisgah, you've arrived at the promised land. Anatheism is a constant wagering, navigating, negotiating, deciphering, discerning. As Samuel Beckett, my compatriot, said, I can't go on, I'll go on. Given the immigration problem, I can't go on, I go on. Given the war situation in Gaza, Ukraine, I can't go on. We can't go on, we go on.
And what are like you have described 5 motions of anatheism?
Mm-hmm.
What are they, and can you explain them clearly and how they relate to the whole concept in general?
I can't, because I can't remember what they are.
You can't?
No.
So,
I remember humor was one of them.
Humor, imagination,
yes,
commitment, discernment, and hospitality.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think I mentioned hospitality. I think I mentioned commitment. I think
the most interesting for me is humor. How does it?
Yeah. Humor is really important because, you laugh in face of the impossible. There's a wonderful phrase by Meister Eckhart, the mystic, who says, God laughed and gave birth to the Son. The Son laughed and gave birth to the Spirit. The Spirit laughed and gave birth to the Father. In other words, the laughter is the first and last word. And laughter is something you can do, you can laugh when faced with the impossible, when faced with a contradiction, right? So, for example, Laurel and Hardy, the funny film, there's a big fat man and a little skinny man. The two together make you laugh because, as Bergson says in his book on humor, it is contradiction that makes you respond by saying there's no rational way of sorting this out or responding to this, so you laugh. So laughing is this humor, and humor is a recognition that we're not fully in control, that power is not everything. And so there's a deep etymological link, but also a philosophical and existential link between humor and humility. It's, I don't know. I don't know the absolute answer here, but I'm going to give it a go. I'm going to make a wager. I'm going to make a bet. I'm going to try. I can't go on, I'll go on. So there's a humility. There's also a humanity. It's what when you laugh, weep and you weep alone. Laugh and the world laughs with you. And it's true. Laughter connects you. It's a recognition of our interdependency with other human beings, with the gods, and with the animal world, the non-human world. That's why in comedies, take Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, humans are dressed up as animals. Greek comedy, the gods are dressed as humans, the humans are dressed as gods, they're dressed as as serpents, they're dressed as animals. So it's this interdependency where identities are free to play with each other in a way that they wouldn't be in the normal, rational, conventional world. So there's that great sense of being part of an interdependent, connected world. And lastly, there is humanity, humility, humus. There is the fact that we come from the earth. And that's why the best kind of humor is very often earthy humor. It's very carnal. It's very embodied. Most jokes are about elementary matters, and elementary is elementary. It's physical. It brings us back to our embodiment, our incarnate nature. And this is very important because some of the worst crimes are committed by abstract ideas, ideologies, abstractions that are disincarnate, that are invertebrate, that are chillingly disembodied and removed from actual human beings and actual human life. So a recognition of our common humanity as humans who come from the earth, humus, is, I think, absolutely crucial. And in my recent work, I've been moving towards this carnal hermeneutics, my book on touch, the primacy of touch. Because in touch, you not only are touching the world and others, you are being touched. It's a double sensation. You can see without being seen. You can hear without being heard. But you can't touch without being tangible and tactile. And that's a reminder of our embodied carnal connection to the earth. And that to me is absolutely crucial.
Have you experienced the full path of anatheism? Like, did you think that mountain was never there at some point?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've been through dark nights of the soul, very, very terrifying and terrible depressions, and also little moments of just not knowing where I'm going, not knowing who I am, not knowing what to do, or what I should do, or what I could do, all the time. All those little moments of not knowing, to me, are moments of there is no mountain, and then there is. So it's not like it's one linear progress that you start as a theist, then you undergo your dark night of the soul, your moment of not knowing, and then you arrive at the other end as an anatheist. It's something that can go on every day. I was very influenced by Kierkegaard, who talked about the moment of doubt and the leap of faith. But the leap of faith is not something that happens once in your life and then you're saved. You're bathed in the blood of the Lamb. You're saved. You now have your true belief. If one is to be true to oneself and to life, there's always the uncertainties that come back again. There's always the doubts. There's always the not knowing. And that's actually important. In fact, good philosophy begins with a recognition that we don't know. Cusanus is docta ignorantia. The first thing we can know philosophically is that we don't know. Plato, Socrates says the same thing. First thing, if you want to philosophize, is to begin by recognizing that you know nothing. So that's anatheism too. It's kind of everywhere, and it's just a word. It's just a term that helps us to pick up these bits and pieces in philosophy, theology, literature. In anatheism, I reread many authors. Keats's notion of negative capability, that a poetic attitude to the world is finding yourself, I quote, in a condition of, in the midst of uncertainty, mystery, and doubt. Uncertainty, mystery, and doubt without the hankering after fact and reason. Now that's Keats talking about poetry, the attitude to poetry. You don't take everything for granted. You see things as if you were seeing them for the first time, as if you never knew them before. You never encountered them. That is the poetic moment. And then you write new words in a new way. So whether you take it from philosophy, as I've been doing a lot in this interview, or from theology, which I've also been quoting quite a lot, or from literature or painting, or just your everyday existential experiences with other human beings, at a micro level, the people you meet in the street, a macro level, what you hear on the news, what's going on in Ukraine, Sudan, Gaza, the Mexican border, whatever. It's there in each case. And it's a call from the other that says, where are you? And you respond, and it's your choice. It's an anatheist wager. Here I am, or I'm not home. I'm not here. I'm not responding.
And can you explain what is hermeneutics, and is it a continuation of anatheism in a way? Does it relate to anatheism, or is it an entirely different concept?
I think hermeneutics is very related to anatheism in that hermeneutics is based on the premise that we don't just see the world, we see the world as this or that. In other words, seeing is already interpretation. And we do this not necessarily when we're being very cerebral about it and thinking it through theoretically or reflectively, but even in our responses, our physical bodily responses, our senses, we're interpreting the world as this or that, as good or bad, as friendly or as unfriendly, as hospitable or inhospitable, as favorable or unfavorable. We're doing this all the time, and that's interpretation. You see a rock, you see it as a sculpting block, a building block, an obstacle if you want to protect yourself from an enemy. There's so many ways, an ornament if you want to, polish it and put flowers around it. Everything we encounter, we interpret as this or that. That's who and what we are. And basically, our most fundamental hermeneutic interpretation is that between treating the stranger as an enemy or as a friend. And even if we treat the enemy as an enemy, because they are an enemy, we do have enemies. We do have people who want to kill us. We do have people who want to invade us. This is not made up. There's then the wager of how do you interpret your enemy as potentially an ally or a friend? In other words, how can you relate to them in such a way that they or their families or their friends or their compatriots can somehow be appealed to, responded to, such that hostility becomes hospitality. Now, part of that does involve going to war, defending yourself in order to protect other people. It's not some naive, black and white issue. But the wager is always there. You interpret somebody, something, some situation as this or that. And you must be constantly open to reinterpreting it again and again, because the situation can change. The person can change. And if you're stuck with absolutes, I believe in this person absolutely, theism. I don't believe in this person. This person does not exist. This person is not human. This person is evil. And it's black and white. You will never be able to negotiate the anatheist wager, the hermeneutic wager, which realizes that behind a surface meaning, there's always a deeper meaning, a hidden meaning, another meaning. That's what hermeneutics is. You're always interpreting something as something. And there's two ways of doing it, at least two ways, and sometimes multiple ways, because things are layered. They're complex. Nothing is a mere object. It's always a subject that is open to interpretation.
And do you think fighting or going to war to protect your interpretation, your view, justifiable cause?
Sure.
Or let me add more context. For example, do you think the Crusaders were acting because they didn't understand the interpretation of other people? And do you think that caused wars and bloodshed? The fact that people could not understand other people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And they were utterly convinced, as most people are in war and at war, that they are absolutely right and the other person is inhuman, is is an absolute enemy. There's no black and white. There's no shading. That's why the first thing in unjust war is to dehumanize the enemy, not to recognize that there is a potential messiah in every single adversary out there. That's a very difficult thing to sustain, but it's very important. And you can hate the enemy out there, but it's a way of, as Augustine says, repeated by Hannah Arendt, you separate the actor from the act. The act is heinous, it's evil, it's criminal, it's genocidal, etc. But the actor who's committing it is not reducible to that act. You can also interpret the actor as somebody who, in another situation, in another context, could be as human as you are in some respects. And that's the possibility of life after war, the possibility of making peace with the enemy, exchanging stories and wounds with the enemy. And there are some things that have to be let go, and there are other things that can be saved and salvaged in the enemy. And that's a peacemaking process that's absolutely essential.
And to look at the other side of the coin, those people, saints who were tortured based on their beliefs, was it a part of them thinking that this is the only true belief, my interpretation is only the correct one, and that's why I'm gonna endure all this? Is that way a correct way of thinking based on your description?
I never heard of a martyr who says, I'm being killed, but I believe absolutely in the doctrines that I've adhered to. No, they scream in pain, or they say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Right? They call out for forgiveness. They say, don't kill me. That's the most common. They don't say, I'm dying for what I believe. They're saying, I'm suffering. I wish you weren't killing me, but you are. But I don't. I mean, they have their commitment. They have their commitment. They're saying, look, I'm being killed because I live a life of love, and hate is stronger than love at this moment. It's that level. It's embodied. It's a carnal hermeneutic more than some kind of doctrinal belief. So the answer to Levinas says ethics begins by somebody responding to the call, which is, give me bread, do not kill me. And I think the martyrs who died were saying, give me bread, give me love, do not kill me. But the person who is killing them is taking the responsibility to not respond to, where are you? Give me food, give me life. And so that's where the absolutism comes in. It's the executor who has the absolutism, not the victim.
And how can hermeneutics play role in uniting the divided societies, divided regions, countries?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, what I've been trying to do in the Guest Book Project and in several of my recent books, Radical Hospitality and so on, is promote a notion of narrative hospitality where divided communities share each other's stories. They tell their own story, their own wound, then they listen to that of the enemy, and then they try and create a third story. So we operate, digital storytelling in the Guest Book Project, which is based on the premise, exchanging stories, changing histories. That if people can exchange stories with the enemy, they can develop some even minimal element of empathy and realize that one person's story of victory is another person's story of defeat. One person's story of happiness is another person's story of pain. And by telling your own story, owning your pain, owning your position, owning your power, then listening to the other, and then being open to co-creating a story with them, that is, I think, a hermeneutic of narrative hospitality, that's very related to anatheism. It's not necessarily anything to do with God or a God after God, but it is a belief that the stranger, that in hosting the stranger can become not just the enemy, hostis as enemy in hostility, but hostis as friend, hospitality. And I'll just maybe end with this story, which was very formative for me. When I was a young professor in University College Dublin, I was asked to be a moderator in a meeting between ex-paramilitary prisoners in Northern Ireland. One group from the Republican IRA community, the other from the Unionist Loyalist UDA. And we gathered in this room in Derry, also called Londonderry, Londonderry for the Protestants, Derry for the Catholics, a very divided city. And I was chairing this discussion. At one point, somebody stood up and he told a story of how one day he had been taken from his bed in his family house and bundled into a van and taken to a barn where he was blindfolded and tied up in a chair, and a gun was put to his head, and he was about to be shot. He was a member of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. And before he was shot, he took he asked his would-be assassin, if he could have smoke a cigarette, a last cigarette. And the assassin gave him the cigarette. And so he smoked, and he smoked very slowly. And as he smoked very, very slowly, slower than he'd ever smoked in his life, he told his killer of how he had grown up in a society in Northern Ireland where his grandfather had been killed by the British Army, his father had been imprisoned and tortured without trial, his mother had committed suicide, his sister had suffered from clinical depression, remained unemployed all her life, his brother had been kneecapped and also interred without trial. And basically, he said, after all that, seeing all that, and it happened to me too, I joined the IRA and I planted bombs. And he finished his cigarette and he waited for the gun to go off, which was placed to his forehead. But there was no sound of a gun. There was nobody speaking in the room. So eventually he managed to free himself. He looked around, there was nobody in the room. And so he got up and walked home. He told that story, and another man stood up at the back of the hall, put up his hand, and I said, yes, would you like to speak? And he said, yes. He said, I was the assassin. I was the assassin who was ordered to kill this man. And I was ready to do it. I was certain I was right. I knew it was the right thing to do. But when I gave him that cigarette and when he told his story, I realized hearing his story that it was my story and I couldn't kill him. And that's a very simple example, but a dramatic, true example of how an exchange of stories can actually bring about a change in history. And those two prisoners then became sort of peace envoys who went to different schools and, told their story and their exchange of stories and how it changed their history. And I think it was situations like that, and many poets and educators and peacemakers in Northern Ireland who engaged in the exchange of stories with their enemy, that led to the Good Friday Peace Agreement in 1998, which took the arms out of Irish politics. So, Northern Ireland is never as bad as Gaza or the Middle East or South Africa or the Sudan or the Ukraine, but it's a seed of hope. And if it can happen there, it can maybe happen elsewhere. But you begin with the little things. You begin with two people talking about their lives. And in exchanging stories, maybe that can bring about a little miracle of turning the impossible into the possible.
And that was my next question. Do you think those kind of exchanges of stories could maybe help resolve conflicts that are active today, like in Israel and Gaza and in Ukraine?
I do, and I think I think it's where we should start. I mean, I've been doing it with young people, particularly. I think you start with young people. The older people get, the more hardened they become in their theisms, if you will, in their absolutisms, in their tribalisms, in their certitudes, their ideologies. Um, but young people, um, I think, are more vulnerable, fragile, and open to change, and also they are more adept at digital storytelling. And I've found that in the many films we've made with young people, the videos which they make with their iPhones, um, they can relate to their enemy, the other side of the community divide, um, either in person or very often much easier digitally through an audiovisual distance, because it enables them to have a certain freedom, and then they can co-create digitally together. I have big problems, big criticisms of AI and where it can go in terms of rendering us as an excarnate, disembodied community, where everything is virtual and nothing is felt or real. But in this instance, where people are coming from such suffering, such woundedness, such physical, carnal pain, that actually the detour of the digital in the exchange of stories. This is my story. I'm telling it as I see it. The other person does the same, then they exchange and they create a third. Actually works better because of the distance. And I'll tell you a quick story about an example of this that I learned from. I was giving a talk in McGill University in Montreal many years ago, and it was on um, the respective powers, merits of different depictions of the Holocaust. So the two films I was taking were Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, which is a 10-hour documentary to camera witnesses of survivors. Nothing fictional, nothing edited, absolute face-to-face realism. And then on the other hand, you had Spielberg's film Schindler's List, a fictionalized documentary, two totally different ways of portraying the Holocaust. So I was going back and forth on the merits and demerits, vices and virtues of the two depictions. And at the end of it, a little old woman came down and she spoke to me and she said, "You know, I was on Schindler's List. I was one of the survivors." And she said, I survived the war thanks to Schindler. Went to Italy, then to Paris, then to Israel, then to Montreal, where I've lived for the last 50 years. And I never told my husband, I never told my doctor, I never told my rabbi, I never told my children, I never told my friends anything about what happened to me. It was too traumatic. I just, erased it from my consciousness. But she said, my granddaughter said, I'm going to a movie, and I went to the movie with her, and I discovered there myself being played by a fictional character. I was in the movie. And she said, seeing myself as another, right? As imagined by another, as performed by another, I was able to revisit my own experience through the vicarious fictional character that was playing me. And I became a self as another, so to speak, which enabled me to recover myself. And then, after I saw the movie, I was able to tell my husband, my friends, my family, and so on. But I couldn't connect with it until that exchange of stories, if you will. Now, it's not with the enemy, it's with another person playing her in a situation where she's confronted with an enemy. But you can extend that also to relating to an imaginary enemy or relating to a represented enemy, a narrated enemy. And there's something in the movement from history to story, telling things not necessarily as they happen, but as if they happen in this way or that, that enables you then to come back to history again. There's history after the story. There's history that's fixated, can't find a way out, then turned into story. There's a laboratory of possibilities. You can experience it this way or that. You can be yourself. You can be the enemy. I mean, you go to Hamlet. You see Hamlet, and you're Hamlet one moment. The next moment, you're Claudius, the villain. You know, you're the hero. You're the anti-hero. That's what fiction allows you to do. It's the juxtaposition of opposite and discordant qualities, as Coleridge says about literature. And so, after the movement from history to story, there's that liberating of possibilities, which enables you to revisit and refigure history in a new way. And that's very similar to anatheism. You go from the certainty of theism to the certainty of anatheism to the new possibility of anatheism. So that would be my wager about stories. It's not enough. It's not enough to tell stories. You also have to shake hands. You have to move from text to action, from story to history. But it liberates a space that enables you to reconfigure history in new ways, and to share bread in new ways, to shake hands in new ways, to literally make peace actively, literally, really, in time and space.
And has technology, like you mentioned, AI and social media and fake news and all those things, have they made it difficult to determine the correct interpretations, to decide what's correct? And how do we navigate in this world with so much uncertainty in it?
Yeah. Well, there we're back to the anatheist wager and trust. I think trust was one of the movements which enables you to discern. But it's always a discernment. It's not because you go to AI or the virtual mode of communications that you solve the problem. On the contrary, if anything, you open up further possibilities of interpretation. It becomes more difficult. There are liberties, like I've just described, but there are also extra responsibilities to learn how to read the code. And there, I think we need to remember, and I'll end with this, that the digital means two things. It means a code, right? A virtual code, which is AI and cyber communications and everything else, where we become cyborgs, cyber beings. And then there's the digital as our fingers and our toes, right? Which is the epitome of our identity, hence fingerprints on passports, of our physical being. Our physical ontological being is represented digitally by our hands and our feet. And that's where we come back to our humanity as humus, that we are earthly creatures, we're embodied creatures, we're incarnate creatures, we're carnal, sentient creatures. And I think the important wager, hermeneutic wager, is to keep together those two ways of interpreting the world. Digitally as virtual code, which can open us to all kinds of transatlantic, intergalactic communications. We're deterritorialized in the extreme. We can communicate across all kinds of borders and distances and boundaries. But that has to be kept in contact. That openness to the universal has to be kept in contact with our fidelity to, our sentient fidelity to the particular, to the singular, to the lived in the here and now, to humus. So both senses, it's not an either or of the digital as fingers and toes versus the digital as universal code. We need both at one and the same time if we are to make the correct interpretations.
Mm-hmm. And if you have time, can I ask you one more question?
One more, but I'm freezing cold because I haven't. I've just come out of a storm. Yes, one quick question.
So this is the question that is not directly to this topic, but I always thought about it myself, and I want to hear your opinion about it. So in religion, especially in Western religions, so there is this importance of faith. So my question that I ask myself is, why is faith important? Why does it give me virtue if I believe? Why can't I know? So that's my question to you. What's your view on that?
Well, my simple answer to that, and very modest answer to that, is one has faith because one doesn't know enough. One doesn't know everything. One doesn't know absolutely. And therefore, when one reaches the limits of what one knows, one accepts what one does not know, and one makes a wager. And that wager is called faith. And faith comes from fidens. It comes from trust. That's what it means. You know, as in fiançailles, as in fidens, fidelity. It's a trusting. Ultimately, it's a trusting that the world can be better than it is. And there's no certainty about that. There's no proof of that. There's no way of verifying it in terms of epistemological certitude or knowledge. It's because I don't know if the good will prevail that I have faith that it does. And that's why I believe faith must always supplement and exceed and lead knowledge. If we believe more, then we can try to know more.
All right. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure talking to you, and I wish you all the best in the future.
Okay. Well, it's my pleasure.